Does allowing transgender service members impact military readiness? I'm Sonia Dabrazini, and this is Scholars Mate. Hello and welcome to Scholars Mate. I'm your host, Sonia Dabrazini. The ban on transgender individuals serving in the military has vacillated in recent years. The Obama administration ordered a lift on the ban, but President Trump in March 2018 announced that he would reinstate it. Current and future transgender service members are in limbo as they wait for clarification. At issue is whether this ban would impact U.S. military readiness and thus affect national security. Joining us via Skype to discuss the issue is Belkin, founding director of the Palm Center. Aaron designed and implemented much of the public education campaign responsible for helping end the military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in 2011. He is the author of How We Won: Progressive Lessons from the Repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and has written and edited more than 30 scholarly articles, chapters, and books. And also joining us in the studio is Peter Sprigg, Senior Fellow for Policy Studies at the Family Research Council. He is the author of Outrage: How Gay Activists and Liberal Judges Are Trashing Democracy to Redefine Marriage. And he was co-editor of another FRC book on homosexuality. He previously served as pastor of Clifton Park Center Baptist Church in Clifton Park, New York, and as economic development assistant to the late Congressman Robert Dryden. Thank you both, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Now, the LGBT movement has come a long way, but culturally, in society, Peter, we started off with the modern feminist movement. You wrote an article on this. Can you explain that?
Well, I said that in a sense we've seen an assault on the sexes, an assault on the idea that human beings are created male and female, and that our status as biological males or biological females has at least some implication for certain roles that we play. Particularly in respect to relationships such as marriage and our sexuality, and also with respect to our gender identity as well. What we see with the transgender movement is sort of the climax of this movement, whereby the philosophy is being put forward that when there is a disconnect between your psychological perception of gender and the physical status of your body, that somehow your psychological status should take priority every time in terms of identifying who you really are. And we think that, in fact, the biological sex, which has to do with your body's reproductive capacity, it has to do with your internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, and the chromosomal makeup of every cell of your body, that is really a more definitive way of defining who is male or female than is a subjective psychological state of being. Aaron?
Sure. Everyone is free to their philosophical opinion about what gender means. That's the meaning of democracy, that you get to have your own opinions. But what you don't get to do is dismiss the science on the basis of your own philosophy. And there's a global medical consensus, as confirmed by the U.S. Surgeon General, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, unanimously among medical professional associations, that when transgender people need to transition gender, that's a medical need. No different really than if you have a broken arm and you have a medical need to heal your arm.
All right, thank you, Aaron.
Actually, my point was the opposite, that the science is in favor of defining people biologically, and it's a philosophy that says that their gender identity takes precedence. So we disagree on that point.
That's fine, gentlemen. That's fine.
Well, we do, but the American Medical Association and the medical community globally, by consensus, agrees with me.
Well, it's interesting. Let me mention that because this is the point I was going to bring up. He says by consensus. People need to be aware that normally the normal evaluation of medical issues is supposed to be, in the last 20 years, is supposed to be evidence-based. When someone says that a medical position is based on consensus, what they are doing is conceding that it is not evidence-based.
Sure, but their opinions are based on mountains of peer-reviewed research in scientific and medical journals, and that's evidence. I mean, their positions are no less evidence-based than the evidence on depression or any other mental health or medical condition for that matter.
All right, gentlemen, let's get to the main question at hand here. Could you explain how allowing transgender individuals to serve in the military impacts military readiness, Peter?
Yes. Allowing service members who have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria or who have undergone a gender transition does pose a clear threat to military readiness. And the reason is the physical health and mental health problems that are associated with that condition or with those procedures. A key principle, for example, in addressing military readiness is the deployability of individual military personnel. The military's normal standard of medical fitness is that each service member should be able to be deployed anywhere in the world at any time without the need for specialized medical care. And I believe that is not a standard that can be met by most individuals who have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and especially those who are undergoing a medical gender transition.
Aaron?
Well, the question of deployability is interesting, and in the Pentagon's recent report, the report that proposed reinstating the ban on transgender individuals, the report went to great lengths to argue that in theory, hypothetically, transgender people are not deployable. But what the report didn't do was present evidence that the Defense Department had been sitting on, and which was not made public until yesterday when the Palm Center released a study based on the Defense Department's own data, but again, data that had not been presented in the Pentagon's report, that showed that almost 400 transgender troops, many of whom have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, what the Pentagon's data showed is that almost 400 service members diagnosed with gender dysphoria deployed to the Middle East in support of Operation Enduring Freedom and other operations in the Middle East. And only one had to be sent home out of those 400 service members. So the Pentagon's own data show that transgender troops are as deployable as anybody else. You know, service members sometimes have medical needs. And transgender people are no different, but that doesn't mean that they're not deployable.
Okay, so when someone is undergoing this treatment, it's costly, and if they are deemed non-deployable, what happens to that service member?
Well, that's an important question, and you mentioned the cost. I authored a report last year in an effort to estimate the cost that this could impose on the military, and our estimate that it could cost the military anywhere from 1.9 to I'm forgetting the second number, $3.5 billion, I think, over a period of 10 years. Now, that includes the direct medical costs of hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery, but it also includes the lost time for people who are non-deployable, either because they are recovering from gender reassignment surgery or because they are taking time off for the so-called real-life experience, which is recommended as a prerequisite to a gender transition. So now that was based on numbers similar to the larger number in the Pentagon study of those who identify as transgender. The number who have actually been diagnosed with gender dysphoria is smaller than the estimate that we made last year, but that estimate was based on pro-LGBT sources that were available at the time.
So, Aaron, would you agree, though, that this is somewhat costly and that there is a large psychological impact on an individual undergoing this surgery?
Well, cost and psychological impact are different questions, so I'll address each in turn. On cost, I published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine estimating that the annual cost of providing transition-related care would be about $5 million per year. The RAND study published an analysis that came up with roughly the same estimate. They said between $2 and $8 million per year. So the Defense Department now has 1 year of data, and they found that they spent only $2 million on transition-related healthcare. Now, $2 million is a lot to a person, but the military's healthcare budget for the active component is $6 billion. And $2 million is really a rounding error. But so the estimates that Congresswoman Hartzler and Peter Sprigg put out were inflated above the actual data by more than 1,000 times. And the reason that the New England Journal of Medicine and the RAND Corporation got the numbers right is because we knew, based on extensive research in the civilian sector, that the vast majority of transgender people do not undergo gender transition. And so now we have 14,700 transgender individuals serving, and only 7% have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. And of those, only a subset need to transition. And that 7% reflects a backlog because care has never been provided. So the bottom line is, whether the actual cost is 2 million or 8 million or 10 million, whatever, I'm not advocating wasting money, but every single service member is entitled by statute to medically necessary care, and this care is not expensive. Now, as for the psychological impact, Peter Sprigg is absolutely right that if a service member doesn't meet medical standards, physical or psychological standards, and can't do their duty and is non-deployable for more than a year, they need to leave the military. That's a policy, that's an even-handed policy. It applies across the board, and I fully support that. But very few transgender individuals are non-deployable for that long. Most people who transition, and again, it's a very tiny subset of transgender individuals in the military who transition, most of them are done with their transition in a very short time. Those who are not need to leave the military and will be separated under existing standards.
Right, and you mentioned a number, 14,000 estimated transgender service members are serving in the U.S. military. Of that, 8,900 are in active component. The rest are in selected reserve. Do you think that number is high, Peter?
I think that number probably is high. It's based on a survey. It's not based on actual direct reporting from all members of the force as to their gender identity. But one thing to know, just for your viewers to put this in perspective, I don't think that the media has given enough attention to the fact that if we accept the numbers that are in the Defense Department report, then actually what the Trump-Mattis policy is saying is that 9 out of 10 transgender service members are free to continue to serve as long as they abide by the same standards that apply to every other service member. And the idea that everyone who's transgender is being kicked out of the military, or would be if this policy took effect, is not true if we accept the numbers in that report, and if we accept the definitions of transgender and gender dysphoria that Aaron shared with us earlier.
Now, interestingly enough, your executive vice president of the FRC is retired Lieutenant General Jerry Belkin, and he has stated that Secretary Mattis and Congress need to ensure the priorities of the U.S. Armed Forces remain those that the Secretary has outlined: mission readiness, combat proficiency, and combat effectiveness.
Well, I absolutely agree with that. And this is, again, I'll state an opinion. I know that Aaron may disagree with it, but my opinion is that when the policy was changed under the Obama administration by Defense Secretary Ash Carter, that the motivation for that change was political. It was not medical. It was to use the military as an instrument for social engineering, to force the greater acceptance of the transgender movement in the larger society. So I think that Secretary Mattis and President Trump have returned to the appropriate priorities. And I want to come back and just make a comment about the cost. For example, there's no question that the cost of transgender care as a percentage of the total health care provided by the military is very small. But we need to also look at it on the individual level. And the Defense Department report said that those who have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria thus far have medical costs that are 300%, 3 times higher than those of other service members. I think it raises a serious question of fairness when we devote those extra resources to this tiny population.
Aaron, bringing it over to you, since the beginning of April, there have been significant organizations and people backing this policy of transgender inclusion having not harmed unit cohesion. And that includes what? The American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, 6 former surgeon generals, and what about all the military chiefs?
Yeah, so this might actually be one of the few areas where Peter Sprigg and General Belkin and I agree, which is that military readiness has to come first. This is not about civil rights. It's certainly not about LGBT rights. But the military itself has a very proud and explicit history of explaining to the American people that a diverse force is an effective force, and diversity is actually a tool that the military uses to promote readiness on many different levels. So the report that the Pentagon issued a month ago went to great lengths to say that hypothetically there might be problems with unit cohesion as a result of including transgender service members. But after 2 years of inclusive policy, the report was not able to identify any evidence whatsoever that there's been a problem with cohesion. And sure enough, over the last several weeks, the service chiefs have all testified in Congress that there has not been any problem with cohesion as a result of transgender inclusion. I would say one thing, because Peter Sprigg brought up 2 very important points that I would like to address briefly, if it's allowed in my time.
Absolutely.
But just on the question of cost, it is true that the Pentagon reported that medical costs for people diagnosed with gender dysphoria are 300 times higher than for the military average. 300%. But the difference is $6,000 on average versus $18,000 per year for those diagnosed with gender dysphoria. But the key is, if you identified any population on the basis of a healthcare need, if you said, what's the cost of keeping people in the military who have, broken their knee? By definition, it's going to be higher than the average cost. So the point about cost is that you can divide the numbers however you want, but the bottom line is that the Pentagon, despite the exaggerated estimates that the healthcare would cost $1 billion, the Pentagon spent $2.2 million on healthcare for trans people last year.
All right, gentlemen, let's move on. Right now, it is time to take some questions from our viewers. The first question comes from Alvin Farmer. He asks, why does the left want to ban military recruiters from college campuses, but also force it to accept transgenders? Aaron?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Most progressives I know want military recruiters to be on campus because they want the military to reflect the diversity of the United States. So again, I don't understand the premise of the question, but in terms of why do people, not just Democrats, but bipartisan consensus, consensus is too strong a word, but if you look at the recent polling data, and also after President Trump tweeted that transgender people couldn't serve, I think it was 9 or 10 Republican senators spoke out and said, we don't like that idea so much. So it's not just, like San Francisco liberals like me who are pushing the military towards inclusion. It's that the research shows that inclusive policy is best for readiness, and most of the country agrees with that.
Peter?
Well, I'm not sure about the premise of the question either. That the questioner might have been thinking about when homosexuals were excluded from the military, and there were some college campuses that tried to prevent military recruiters from coming onto their campus because they objected to the military policy on homosexuality. But that's in the past now. So I'm not sure the premise of that question either.
All right, the next question comes from Gretchen Griffin. She asks, is there something distinctive about the U.S. military that prevents it from successfully integrating transgenders into its ranks? Peter, you want to start this one off?
Well, yes, this is the point that I've made, is that the military has unique demands, places unique demands upon service members, both in terms of their physical health and physical fitness, and in terms of their mental health, because of the extreme stresses to which they are subjected. And therefore, it's perfectly logical that the military would have standards that are more restrictive than you might find in a situation of civilian employment, for example. So I think that that's a large part of the reason is that this debate is not about whether transgender individuals can contribute to society as a whole. Mm-hmm. The debate is about whether they have unique issues which limit their ability to contribute to the military. And I think that the answer is yes.
Aaron? Is there something distinctive about the U.S. military that prevents it from successfully integrating transgenders into its ranks?
No, there's not. The military has long argued, from the most senior general or flag officer down to the bottom of the ladder, that diversity is a tool that helps military readiness, that inclusive policy that when the military reflects American society in its diversity, that promotes readiness. Treating people according to one single standard, that promotes readiness. Letting people be honest about who they are promotes readiness. Providing medically necessary care promotes readiness. The service chiefs just went in front of Congress over the last several weeks and testified that over 2 years of inclusive policy, there have been, quote unquote, zero problems of unit cohesion, even though, according to Army Chief of Staff Milley, he has, quote unquote, closely monitored the situation. So we have lessons from 18 foreign militaries, from the US military, from the research that all confirms the same point, which is that when you treat people equally, when you have inclusive policy, that's what promotes readiness. That's what the research shows. That's what the data show.
Thank you, Aaron. And now it's time for Answer This, where each guest asks a question directly to the other. Who would like to go first? Do we flip a coin?
I can go first.
Okay, Peter.
Aaron, in light of the fact that even the Rand Corporation study, which is usually cited in support of transgender military service, said that transition-related treatments could result in 75 to 135 days of non-deployability, how can you claim that it does not harm military readiness at the individual level?
Very few transgender service members need to undergo gender transition while they're in the military. That's one consideration. And second of all, transgender service members who do undergo medical transition, many of them transition very quickly and don't need to miss time off from work. I'm friends with a British helicopter pilot who transitioned from male to female. She didn't miss a day of military service. She transitioned during her personal month-long vacation. I absolutely agree that if someone's medical care requires them to be non-deployable for a year, that consistent with all other service members, they need to be discharged. That's absolutely the case. But look, service members have medical needs. Some service members are temporarily downgraded, temporarily non-deployable for all kinds of reasons. So transgender people are no different in that regard. But by simply assuming that there's a possibility that all transgender service members are going to be non-deployable for a year, you're using assumptions to displace the actual data of what happens. Again, we have 2 years of inclusive policy under our belts now. We have not seen problems with cohesion, and we have not seen problems with non-deployability. The Carter policy gives commanders, as is the case with all non-emergency medical care, it gives commanders the right to schedule treatments a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right to accommodate deployments. And that's why inclusive policy is not inconsistent with deployability.
All right, Aaron, what is your question for Peter?
So I don't mean to be a bad participant in the show, but I actually just wanted to say something instead of ask something, which is that Peter and I have never met. We've been debating back and forth
on paper
for I think decades. And I just want to say to Peter that I think you're a worthy opponent, and I do respect your opinions, and I respect your position, and I'm grateful for the chance to finally interact, not quite in person, but more directly than has been the case before.
Well, now it is time for our segment where we agree, where each guest names something the other said that he agrees with. Peter?
Well, Aaron actually didn't bring this up, but it's something that I've heard from other critics of the Trump-Mattis policy, where I think that we agree. And that is that the issue here is not whether transgender Americans are patriotic or have a desire to serve their country. Sometimes it's been said that every patriotic American who wants to serve should be allowed to serve. Mm-hmm. The fact is there are many patriotic Americans who are not allowed to serve because of physical health, mental health, or behavioral conditions. Secretary Mattis in the report says that there are 71% of young people ages 17 to 24 in the country are not eligible to serve in the military. So I hope that no one will think that we are suggesting that transgender people are not patriotic and do not have a desire to serve their country. Our concerns have to do with tangible physical and mental health issues.
Aaron?
Yeah, I think Peter Sprigg and I actually agree on a lot. And most importantly, we agree that this issue is not about civil rights or LGBT rights. It's about what's best for the military. Mm-hmm. And I think also importantly, we agree that all service members should be held to exactly the same standards. There shouldn't be any separate rights, any special category, any relaxation of standards for anybody.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure. That's all the time we have for today. We'd like to thank Aaron Belkin of the Palm Center and Peter Sprigg of the Family Research Council for joining us today to discuss how allowing transgender individuals to serve in the military impacts military readiness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Scholars Mate. I'm Sonia Debrezini. We'll see you next time.